the 2020 Computer Science Senior Thesis question and answer session. So you all know me. My name is Mark Mahoney, and I'm going to be the host today. So I worked with these seniors for the last 9 months, believe it or not, seniors, while they conceived and implemented their senior thesis projects. So we started last fall coming up with ideas and exploring new technologies. And over time, each student narrowed in on a project, and I hopefully helped set the right scope for the project. And I think it really was a good year, and I'm very happy to post the video presentations of the thesis projects. So we had not intended on having video presentations, but I am pretty happy with how they turned out. I feel like the students were able to show their working projects very well and were able to emphasize the interesting parts of them, perhaps even better than if we were having live presentations. So typically in a live senior thesis presentation, there's a question and answer session. So that's the only missing piece this year, and this is why we're all here today. So hopefully you all had the chance to watch the videos and have some questions for these students. And I'm going to ask that each student respond to questions from the audience. And I would like to just try having the audience members unmute their mics and ask questions. But if that turns out to be too chaotic, then we may need to switch to the chat feature. So I'll try and keep an eye out for how well that is working. So normally at the end of these presentations, the CS department would take all the seniors out to dinner. And I'm very disappointed that that's not going to happen this year. So perhaps Perry and Rick and Erlen and I can figure out a way to make up for that one day. Maybe we could invite all the graduating seniors back for next year's dinner. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the students to respond to questions in the order that they had originally chosen to do their presentations, starting with Gavin Kaepernick. So Gavin's project is particularly interesting because he had a real external customer, a family friend of his, and he built a mobile app for his customers to showcase the work that the customer did to potential clients. So why don't we open it up for questions for Gavin?
Hey, Gavin, I got a question for you.
Okay.
You hear me?
Yep.
You had written somewhere that you chose Swift because your customer was an Apple user.
Uh-huh.
What would, as your front end, what would you have chosen if you'd been a Windows user?
If he had been a Windows user, I probably would have ended up choosing something like Flutter, because I know that there is a lot. When I was looking at what I wanted to build my application in beforehand, before I had chosen Swift, I wanted to look at all the different like mobile frameworks that they have, and Flutter is kind of considered to be one of the leading mobile frameworks, because it can be used on both iPhones and Androids. But the simplicity of building an iOS application on a Mac for an iPhone user is a lot. I figured that I'd be able to build a better application for my customer in that way, because I didn't have the constraint of needing to be able to implement it for Android phones. But if I had to do it for Android phones or Windows users, I would have used something like Flutter.
Okay, let me follow up with that by inviting Josh to tell you what he found about Flutter. Josh, what would you say to Gavin?
Flutter is a very viable option. Only reason I didn't go with it is because of its, I wouldn't say immaturity, but I found that Ionic using Angular was a much more mature ecosystem or framework, and I thought that would be the better way for me. But if you're going for a native, actual like full capability application, Flutter is completely fine with that.
Yeah. In my free time, I've been doing some stuff with Flutter, and I have enjoyed it. I love its the declarative style of building UIs, which is really nice, because everything is considered like a widget or a container, and you just kind of build within itself. And Apple actually just came out with a new one of those that's called Swift UI, and it's their new declarative framework way of building old school storyboard applications, but it is very immature and new, and so that's why I didn't go with Swift UI. I chose to use Swift Storyboard because there is a lot more stability in that framework because it is used by a lot more people and it's a lot older, so they've had time to work out all the bugs.
Cool. So in the next J term, I'm planning on doing a mobile course, and not quite sure what I'm going to do yet, but I was planning on featuring Flutter. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, any other questions for Gavin?
I got a question.
Okay.
So you have a way, looking through your presentation, really cool app, and you have this way of, you can have multiple users logging in to show off for that company.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever think or have any ideas on how you might expand this app for more than just one company?
Yeah, so that was actually something that Mark and I had talked a lot about. And it was one of those things where I think that it can be done. The implementation of doing that came out to be a lot more complicated than I would have previously anticipated. And so I began to do that. But it was one of those things where I wanted to be able, I had the duty to my customer first before I had the duty of building out my own application. And so I wanted to make sure I could build the best product for my customer and his needs before reaching out into one of those other things. So that is something that I could implement over time, but I wanted to make sure that my completion was kept in sight of my customer as opposed to my own personal gain.
Okay, great.
Great.
Any other questions for Gavin?
How's my sound now?
Oh, perfect, Barry.
Really good.
Okay, I'm using a different microphone, one of these bad boys.
Wow. Maybe you can
So-
sing us a song or play guitar or something.
I don't think so. So very cool. Now, the Apple ecosystem is known for providing these wonderful toolkits and all these GUI tools, and the application is gorgeous. So I have a question for you though. Is there a point where you came to a fork in the road about going one way or another with the UI, and you decided to take a path that you're especially pleased with?
Yeah, so I kind of originally built out the application with the very main components. So I know in the context view, it's very much like an iPhone where it just looks and scrolls, and it has kind of like a table view where it just all it is rows. And then as I was building, I'd come across this thing called the collection view, which I actually found to be really cool. And that's what I used on the project section, which allowed to do that horizontal scroll with these things called cards as opposed to tables. And so I kind of just built it as I went along, and if I found something that worked better or I thought, was cooler, then I would kind of fork. But there was, I guess you could say, a lot of forks in the road decisions on whether or not I wanted to use one tool or not another. But that was probably my biggest one, was how to display information on like the main screen for both projects and contacts. And I figured that sticking with the contacts one as is, because it's most similar to other styles of contacts list, but projects had the flexibility to look different and be able to display information more differently. And so that was kind of the main one that I had come across, and why I had chosen to do that for both contacts and projects.
It was a beautiful app.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, why don't we move on to Chase Lange. So Chase's project grew out of frustration with a piece of software that maybe some of us here have used on campus to schedule rooms. And I know I've had the misfortune of having to use the same software, and it really is not designed very well. And Chase and I discussed quite a bit kind of the user experience. So why don't we open up questions for Chase?
Hello. Sorry about my camera. It isn't working, so you won't be able to see me. But if you have any questions,
Well, Chase, I'll jump in there. You had a little bit at the end about an approval or denial of request. That is, if I'm trying to schedule a room, should I just be able to do it and authorize it myself, or kind of go into a waiting line and have someone have to approve it for me? What are the pros and cons of that? And what exactly did you end up implementing?
so what I ended up implementing was just that if the room and date and time combination were available, that the event would be successfully pushed to the database and scheduled without any admin input. The pros and cons of it is basically comes down to how the rooms want to be used. Occasionally we'll have people who try to schedule very small events in like very big rooms. If any of you have been in the TARC skyboxes, you know those rooms are massive and you don't really need that big of a room for a small event. So a lot of times they would like to kind of funnel certain events into certain areas and also just make sure everyone has the correct technologies that they'll be needing in those rooms, because faculty will sometimes try to reserve rooms needing a doc cam, and the room they're trying to reserve doesn't have a doc cam, and such as stuff like that. The biggest downfall of that is then that brings in an element that you have to have a person constantly monitoring the queue of events and making sure that they are approving and denying them in a manner that is efficient and quick and on time, as well as making sure they don't accidentally step on toes. So trying to move maybe a board meeting out of a room to move another meeting into it, and that causes problems because they need a piece of technology that maybe wasn't communicated very well in the event description. It just kind of becomes more work for people, and you have to then have people monitor it.
Okay.
Any other questions for Chase?
Yeah, Chase, did you have much occasion to go over the design and implementation with some of the folks who might be considered customers?
I did. I interviewed, well, the actual implementation I wasn't able to go over with as many people since Carthage shut down. But in my earlier development back in December, I would have people from my office kind of look into what I was doing and play around with the site, and they seemed to be able to navigate it well enough for what it was. But with Carthage shutting down, I wasn't able to take the actual built project to people and be like, test this. It was mostly just me at the end, unfortunately.
I have a question. You used JSON files to load in your buildings and rooms.
Yes.
Was that more for your development, or does Carthage, do you know if Carthage has rooms or things separated into JSON, or was that simply a way of being able to quickly load for your uses?
It was a way to quickly load. I'm not actually sure how Carthage set up or would set up Ad Astra. I believe Ad Astra comes preloaded to them since they are a separate company and they've just purchased the rights to use the software. My office, the people I was able to talk to weren't aware of how it had been set up. That would be way over all of our heads. But it was a very quick way to implement a campus with all its rooms and buildings, so you didn't have to sit and manually enter everything, which is why I ultimately went with it.
And I can imagine you building another app that maybe would generate that JSON file if needed.
Yeah.
But that really wasn't the focus.
There is ways to convert a CSV file to a JSON file. So that would be something that could be done in the future, hypothetically, to speed it up even more.
Yeah, I've had to build one of those myself, which is why the question came to me.
Okay, great. Let's move on to Josh Hoffman. So Josh's project involves character recognition and mobile app reminders for people dealing with prescriptions. So questions for Josh.
Hi, Josh.
Hello.
You talked about sending your pictures off to the National Library of Medicine. Is that a free thing? Is that accessible through the web? How do you access that, and how does that work? What kind of information do you send, and what kind of information do they send back?
It is a free thing, completely run by the federal government. You can send requests to their server just through a URL, sending different parameters. I send a drug name that I get from the character recognition software, and then just go through and send requests until I get a good request, knowing that it is a registered medication.
Okay, and it's pretty quick. I mean, you send it, and
Yep, it's pretty quick. Yeah.
okay, interesting.
I have a question.
Yes.
How would you handle future proofing against the creation of new medications?
Well, with the National Library of Medicine, it is in run by like the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. So I would hope that their server would be and their database would be updated with future drugs and drug names. So I'm pretty reliant on them. So I guess.
Yeah. So just to be clear, you're not downloading a whole database on the phone. Every time you scan the picture, you are sending individual requests to go and grab the whatever's in their database, correct?
Correct, yeah. So I am pretty reliant on them. So really any future proof would be on their shoulders, not mine, I guess.
Okay, cool. Other questions for Josh?
I have a question.
right.
Actually, to further Professor Wheeler's question a little bit, in using this API, are there any limits to it? I've done a few. I've done some work with like Google, for example, and you get like a free tier, for example. But because this is a federal program, can you just like spam it?
Yeah. There weren't any limits in my research for that. So yeah, so no limits, at least for me.
So Josh, did you have to register a key or anything like that?
No, it's completely online. You can just I have the URL and just append a drug name into that parameter. So it's pretty easy to use and free to use.
And the data that came back, was that JSON or was that a web page that you scraped?
It was JSON, yeah.
Okay.
Is that the only API? I know you were getting the drug names, but does it have other use cases?
There are for different, each drug has like an ID. You can send them the ID or any other really small parameters that they store. And I was just using the drug name parameter.
Cool. All right, let's move on to Adam Curtis. So Adam's project combines his senior thesis for GIS and is really, I think, a cool and useful implementation of supervised learning to estimate particulate matter based on the data that we collect here in the US. So questions for Adam Curtis?
Hi, Adam. I was interested in your use of HDF, hierarchical data files. I'm not really familiar with those. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
So basically, they're data format files that store pixel values from satellite imagery. They're specifically used from the NASA's database. And then for use for me, I didn't really use them very much. I converted them into TIFF images, which allowed me to use them within my GIS software. So I didn't work a lot with the HDF files, but they're used to store all the data from satellite images.
Are they compressed files, or is it more like a bitmap? Or did you see converter and don't know.
I'm not totally sure, but I think it's like a bitmap kind of. I was able to open some of them within an HDF viewer, and it had like individual pixels that you could look at and observe.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, more than anyone else's project, I think Adam's, there was so much plumbing involved and conversion from this to that and switching from one server to the next.
Yeah.
I thought it was done really well to bring it all together.
Thank you.
I got a question. So in your presentation, you said that a lot of the hotspot areas kind of lined up with your implementation and stuff that you'd seen, like you looked at China.
Yep.
But some of the non-hotspot areas, it was off, not quite as conclusive. Why do you think that is?
So my project was specifically looking at satellite imagery. A lot of different studies in the past have also included more explanatory variables like meteorological effects or wind patterns, which greatly impact particulate matter. But I specifically wanted to look at how it would be impacted solely with the satellite imagery because that's accessible worldwide, while some data for meteorological isn't worldwide. So I guess some of that, some of the negative values are bad because I don't have enough independent variables to fully predict it accurately.
I have a question.
Yep.
First of all, I want you to know that I was pretty excited to see your thesis because even though I was getting some flashbacks during it to my own. I noticed, I thought it was interesting how you combined all the different systems. So like R, ArcPy, and ArcPro, and then all with like the website and everything, which I got to say was really impressive because I don't know if I would have done that. So I want to know what sort of led you to that path. You know, like why did you choose to implement these systems? You know, did you consider maybe trying just Python or just R, and like what led you to that design choice?
So a lot of the design choice was solely because of how difficult it was to retrieve the satellite imagery data. I wasn't able to retrieve it in something like Python, so I had to use R. And then I was familiar with Python for automation with GIS tools. So I wanted to find a way to be able to connect those two together. So mainly it was, I ran out of options for different ways I could retrieve my data, and it was possibly the best way I could do it, even though it was really difficult.
I have a question for Adam.
Yep.
In your presentation, you had a little cut while it was loading that imagery.
Yeah.
Is that waiting time the same if no matter how many squares you press on, or is it completely dependent on how the area that you're trying to compute?
It gets really long if you add a lot more tiles, specifically because it's doing a lot more HTTP requests to the NASA database, and then it also has to process it in my GIS software. So it takes quite a bit more time. I only tested it on a few squares simply because it was taking quite a bit of time. But yeah, I could see it being pretty long if you selected a huge area.
Oh, Perry, I think you might be muted.
Yeah, that's the story of my life. There's a whole lot of times I wish I were muted, and other times I wish I weren't. So Adam, I echo what others have said about the apparent complexity of bringing together so many technologies and data sources, and I wonder if you have a new appreciation for plumbing.
definitely. I spent so long trying to get system calls to be automated correctly between different programming languages, and to be able to send data back all the way up to my front end was definitely very difficult. So
Well
yeah,
done.
I definitely have a strong appreciation for backend stuff. Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's move on to Lesya Protasova. So Les's project is an examination of intelligent approaches to solving nonograms. And I think her video is particularly well made, and it really convinced me that video presentations of these theses really can be quite effective. So any questions for Les?
Hi, Les. I got a question for you. Often in these types of combinatorial problems, you find that when you randomly generate something, it doesn't always work out. And you found that sometimes the problem is you randomly generate a board and it doesn't have a solution. Sometimes you have multiple solutions. Which exactly was the problem that you encountered, or did you encounter both those problems?
So in my, the way I did it was that I would generate the board first and then derive the hint from that board and give the hint as the initial set or state for the user or the AI. I suppose it would be possible to create a set of hints that did not have any correct valid boards associated with them, but the problem that I was experiencing more so was having hints that could result in more than one valid board.
Okay, very good. Did you do any experimenting with that? Like, what percentage of the time, if you randomly generated a board, would it lead to a set of hints that wasn't predictive of that board? Or what would be like the maximum number, like a worst case scenario? Did you do any of those type of statistics?
I did not look into that.
Okay, that could be further questions. That the mathematician in me is interested in those kind of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions for Les?
This is Perry. Les, I thought your video was fantastic. I thought your project was fantastic. And thank you very much for doing it. Actually, I was so pleased with it. I sent it along to a person in the senior administration who is mathematically inclined and suggested that he take a look at it because he might enjoy it, and that would be the president of the college. So,
thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Les? All right. So last but not least, we have David Zikel. And David's project is all, oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I think we forgot Adam, didn't we? Adam Biewer?
Yeah.
Adam, are you still there? I'm sorry, I skipped you.
There we go.
So let's jump to Adam Biewer. Adam's project is a really interesting visualization project. So Adam had a really meaningful summer internship that I believe inspired him to continue his work and make it his senior thesis. So any questions for Adam about the parallel computational fluid dynamics simulation?
Hey, Adam. I got a question, and this might be really obvious to you, and I hope it is.
I've been working on it for 9 months, so.
Yeah. So what made you choose the visualization software that you did use? I know there's obviously there's other visualization softwares that are available now. I don't know that they take in the information that you were gathering, and that might be the reason. Because there are visualizations now in visual effects software or video game software that take simulations, and I'm sure they abstract a lot of this information. So how did you choose what you used?
So I chose to use ParaView mostly because that's what the professors in the physics department are familiar with. I believe Dr. Crosby is the one who first told me about it. However, working alongside Dr. Carlson as well, he used it as well in some of his experiments. And in doing my own research, I found that ParaView had everything I needed from it. It was able to read in CSV files. It was able to visualize them in a fairly intuitive way. And so I felt that ParaView just sort of worked. Didn't really question it more than that.
And was there ever a time where you thought it didn't have a feature that you wanted, or are you basically, do you have any regrets about using that particular piece of software?
Not that it lacks features. It's not the most intuitive software to get started using. I remember when I was first visualizing it, I sort of was just playing around with it, didn't really know what I was doing. I sort of had to get a crash course on it while I was working on the thesis. I learned about features such as this thing called Point Gauss, which is a much better visualization tool than using just points or whatever else is the default for ParaView. So yeah, it's definitely tricky to use, but it has all the features in it. So if you know how to use it, it'll do what you want it to do.
Yeah, I think in the other Adams case as well, you know, sometimes you are sort of stuck using, you know, what you can use and not perhaps what you necessarily want to use, or you think it's the most user friendly. But again, I think both of you guys adapted very well.
Thank you.
You said that in really early versions of the simulation, when you had the fluid set to basically be idle, it was still moving due to some error. Out of curiosity, what led to that?
Right. So when I first started creating the simulation, I only had one of the 3 motion equations in. Part of the issue there was the boundary conditions. If I set the uniform blob in the water, it would want to leave and just flow out because the boundaries weren't set so that the water would stay inside. It was not at all what I was expecting out of it. And along the process, there were plenty of other times where strange things would happen. Most notably, I remember doing the blob test, as I call it. And rather than like spreading out uniformly, it would create these sort of cylindrical discs spiraling outwards, which I believe I presented during the the end of the first semester.
So yeah, I sometimes tell people one of the great things about computer science is, you know, if you don't like the natural laws that we all sort of have to live with, you can just create your own. But I guess there's a downside too, that you know, sometimes you don't know, if you don't have those laws guiding you, really strange things can happen sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Adam, I want to congratulate you. I think you might be the first student to actually use OMP for a non-class project while still at Carthage. So way to go. You know, when we cover OMP and CompOrg, we only scratch the surface. You know, there's a great deal of richness to it. Did you find yourself using, in the parallelization of your code, did you find yourself using any of the more exotic features, such as the control of barriers and critical sections?
I did not use it that extensively. In my testing, I mostly used it as sort of a way to see how well even the most basic implementation of parallelization can speed up your code. I saw even in small scales, like the smallest one I tested was 20 by 20 by 20, and that sped up the process by 50%, which is incredibly important if you're running simulations that are going to take you 3 or 4 days to finish. Getting an 80% speed up means the difference between finishing it this week and finishing it next month. So as for OpenMP, I mostly just used the Parallel 4 features. I didn't look too deep into it, as most of the code I have written actually uses nested for loops quite extensively to calculate changes in values throughout the simulation. So using Parallel 4 in that instance is extremely efficient, both in coding and speeding up the process.
So there's Amdahl's law, which talks about how much total performance boost one can get, and it comes down to a split between serializable, parallelizable versus serial parts of your code. When you started seeing the results of your parallelization, were there any surprises there?
There kind of were. One thing I really found quite interesting was that the writing the files actually took the longest amount of time out of anything. I believe it was 6 seconds to write the file and 1 second to run the time advance method. So one of the optimizations that can be done there is choosing a larger time interval to write your files, having smaller ones to increment your system to get higher resolution, and then only looking at larger and larger time steps to see how the simulation progresses. If you run the simulation 1,000 times, that would be very quick as compared to writing it 1,000 times.
And how many cores did you have going at once?
On my machine, I believe I had either 8 or 12 cores.
And for how have you given any thought as how you might speed up the I/O speed?
Speeding that up? I'm not really sure. I'd have to. Yeah, I'm not really sure on how I would speed that up.
So what kind of writes were required? In other words, could you maybe not write to the disk and keep more things in memory?
That would be difficult to translate to pair view, as
so it needs the file.
Yeah, most of what I've seen with pair view is you require a file on the disk in order to properly visualize the system. But as I said earlier, if you're not looking to get a high resolution viewing of the simulation and you just want a higher resolution of the simulation being incremented in time, you can choose not to write at every single time increment. Like if you have 10 output files instead of 1,000 for that 1,000 increment simulation, then you only have to write 10 times.
Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, now we will have our final student, David Zikel. And David's project looks at ways of creating distinct files that produce identical MD5 hashes. And I promise that David is not a hacker. He's not trying to get into all of our bank accounts. He's only interested in the algorithmic side of all of this. So, questions for David?
Hey, David. I was interested in what you were talking about, the standard C++ library random number generator. So first part of my question is to correct my ignorance here. Is the random number generator part of the standard C++ library, or is that compiler specific? And two, what exactly was it that you were finding with the standard compiler random number generator?
Yeah, I was using actually C random number generator, which is included in C++ for backwards compatibility, basically. C++ has some really thorough random number generation libraries, but I'm not sure if the C1 is standardized. And the problem I was running into was as soon as you got into making the second pair of blocks, where there's this one really narrow set of conditions they have to meet at the beginning, it would never meet those conditions.
Was it because it's not truly, I mean, obviously it's not truly random, it's a pseudo-random number generator. Do you think there was something about it was detecting that it wasn't random?
There has to be some pattern to it that it's that doesn't work with what I'm trying to do.
Okay.
I have to look at it in my own time, see exactly what it's doing.
Yeah, so I've noticed occasionally some issues with the random number generator too. So a common bug, and maybe David, you could tell us whether this happened or not, but if you seed the random number generator in, say, a loop with the time, that would cause you not to get like random numbers at all, as long as, because these loops are running so fast that the time is not really increasing. So can you verify or tell us whether you seeded the random number generator in a loop, and did you eliminate that as a possibility?
Yeah, I think I only ever seeded it at the beginning of the program.
Okay. Yeah.
Good answer. I taught him in CS1, so
okay. So that
I say, hey guys, you want to make it really random? Let's make it really random by seeding the random number generator a lot of times, and I put it right in the beginning, and it turns out to be not random at all. So David got that one.
Okay,
Yep.
good.
Well, David, if you can explore some other problems with the C standard library RAND, you could enjoy invalidating a great deal of science. Well, one more comment. Would you consider writing an application that would allow a person to modify a file and then have it come out to the same MD5 arranged for the collision?
That wouldn't be, depending on what you mean by modify a file, I don't think that'd be too difficult. You'd have to include the garbage data basically at a specific point in that file.
Yeah, well, so much for hashes and checksums. Yeah.
David, is there any connection between the MD5 stuff that you were looking at and blockchain technology?
Not really. Blockchain uses Bitcoin's blockchain at least uses an actually good hash function for verifying correctness.
Okay.
So MD5 is nice for simple things, but perhaps not as high a quality as some other more modern techniques, right?
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions for David?
Will this work have any impact or bearing on the work you hope to do in grad school?
I think I might. It's in the field I'm going into, and it's pretty impressive, if I do say so myself.
Yeah. And finally, how is it that in 4 years, these are more words than I've ever heard you say at one time?
And speak softly and carry a big hash function collision generator. That's my motto.
Yes.
That's what Teddy Roosevelt said.
Yep.
Okay, so that's it. Again, I want to thank everyone for coming. And although I will be conferring with the other CS faculty in the department before any official decisions are made, I would like to congratulate the CS seniors. I think they did a great job this year. And I think you should all run outside right now and scream screams of joy and cry tears of joy.
With your mask on, of course.
With your mask on, right? It'll be less embarrassing that way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I am going to stop the recording. You're welcome to stick around here on the video here, but I'm going to stop recording now. And again, congratulations all.
Congratulations. Cheers. Maybe I should say